welcome back to my channel. This is Kat. For those of you who are new, I'm so glad that you're here with me. Today I am going to talk about the genres that I think my work is going to fall in, and we are going to look together while the video is going and try to classify some of my videos. So I'm going to go ahead and get Google pulled up. So let me tell you a little bit about my current work in progress. Then we are going to look into Google and just see what are we going to categorize this as. It's obviously going to be fiction, and it is going to be fantasy. So I'm going to look up fantasy genres. They're called subgenres, by the way. Alright, so there are a lot of fantasy subgenres. Like, I just pulled up a list. It said 50 on Readsy. So let me tell you a little bit about this book. That's where we were going with this. My book is about a young woman who is in her early 20s, who is the queen of a human kingdom. There's fantastical creatures, centaurs, elves, hobgoblins, fauns, dwarves, druids. There's just a bunch of different creatures, and they each have their own kingdom. It is a good versus evil. Oh, yay. Okay. Here's a very abbreviated list I'm going to share. High or epic fantasy is good versus evil type storyline. I know that's part of this. This young woman in my story is protecting her kingdom from a oncoming evil. Definitely a high or epic fantasy where one of the main conflicts is good versus evil. That also happens in a world that is not our world. That is part of what makes it a high fantasy. Then there's sword and sorcery, which is very popular. Dark fantasy, fables, fairy tales, arcane punk. I'm not going to read through every genre on here. We're mostly going to click on the ones that I feel are closest to mine. Non-magical fantasy. There is magic in this story, so that's not going to fit for me. Mythic fantasy, modernistic fantasy, science fiction fantasy, which I have been told sci-fi and fantasy don't mix, although there is science fantasy, where there are some rules that are scientifically bound. If your book has any magical or mystical properties that don't have explanations, they just are, that is a fantasy and not a science fiction. In a science fiction world, everything has to have rules. Even if those rules only exist within the world in your story, there has to be an explanation. Another type of fantasy, besides sword and sorcery, which is really the common type, big battles and questing adventures. This is a great list. I'm going to put this on here. This is from a website called bestfantasybooks.com/fantasy-genre. It's got a nice big list. Women's fantasy, vampires, quests where they have to go collect pieces of something. This book is not a questing book. They mostly stay in the Queen's Castle and surrounding area, and then in the dark world for part of the book. Dark fantasy dealing with demonic things and demonic creatures, possibly falling into that. Dying Earth fantasy, that's not what this is. Court intrigue fantasy. This is the other one that I'm thinking. According to this site, court intrigue fantasy is about power, relationships, secrets, and conniving characters who make up the high court of the land. That definitely fits this. So I would say that my book is a mix of the high fantasy or epic fantasy. High fantasy, according to this site, is a broad classification for fantasy. The classic definition of a high fantasy is a story that includes a well-drawn world where magic follows a very specific set of rules. And those rules may be different from the real world, but they are consistent. High fantasy can include many themes, including coming of age, quests, or other serious in tone or epic in scale themes. And epic fantasy is associated with high fantasy, and it includes life or death struggle between good and evil. A large cast of characters. It can have multiple books. Most modern fantasy books are considered epic fantasy according to this site. So there we have it. My book is good versus evil, her versus the demons, her versus the Dark Queen. It's got some high fantasy aspects to it, and then it also has some court intrigue to it between her and what's going on in her castle for a good majority of the book. So that's what I'm going to classify this book as. I'm going to put the link to this page down below for you in the description if you would like to scroll through and let me know what you're working on, what categories are yours in. I'm super excited. I have not shared much about my book with anybody until now, so you guys are the first. So I appreciate you guys tagging along. If you enjoyed watching me sort of figure out how I want to classify my book, give me a thumbs up and stay tuned for my next video. Bye!